Picture yourself as a soldier standing on the walls of your city, exhausted, frightened, and clinging to whatever hope still flickers inside you. For days you've heard rumors carried by traitors and refugees, stories so monstrous they sound impossible, yet everyone swears they're true. Entire cities swallowed by destruction so vast that not a single survivor remained to recount the final moments. Rivers that once nourished life running red with the final offerings of the conquered. Skulls stacked into towering monuments that cast shadows longer than the streets they stand upon. And now the man responsible for all of it has arrived at your gates, his armies stretching across the landscape like a living storm you can neither outrun nor withstand. Your commander steps forward and assures you that there is still a chance to survive, claiming that the conqueror has offered mercy and sworn on his honor that no blood will be spilled if the city surrenders without resistance. With trembling hands, you unlatch the gates, hoping the oath is real, hoping the nightmare stories were exaggerated, hoping that laying down your weapons will spare you and your brothers. But the moment you walk out, you understand just how naive that hope was. The promise is kept, but not in the way you imagined. The soil beneath your feet shifts, enormous pits gape open like hungry mouths, and within moments you and thousands of others are being driven into the earth itself. Dirt cascades over your body, while your screams echo into darkness, and as you choke on soil rather than your own blood, you realize Tamerlane has fulfilled his vow with twisted perfection. When Tamerlane approached the city of Sivas, the defenders already felt the invisible pressure of a reputation so terrifying that it traveled miles ahead of him. A reputation built not merely on victory but on a pattern of punishment so methodical and so psychologically engineered that men who had never seen him trembled at the sound of his name. The Armenian soldiers who stood behind the walls knew every tale that wandered through the markets, stories of populations forced into mass graves, of conquered cities where screams were swallowed by soil rather than steel, of oaths that were honored only in the most twisted and literal sense. Sivas was not ignorant. It was suffocating under the weight of fear even before the first siege engine rolled into sight. And yet, when Tamerlane sent messengers carrying a solemn assurance that no blood would be spilled if the city surrendered peacefully, that ancient code of honor woven into the fabric of medieval warfare cracked open the door to hope. The defenders argued, pleaded, doubted, and reasoned, but exhaustion and desperation softened their judgment. They trusted the one thing they believed even the cruelest conqueror respected, a sworn promise delivered before witnesses. The gates opened slowly, as if the very wood hesitated to obey. The soldiers stepped out, one after another, leaving behind shields, spears, and whatever shred of dignity they still carried. They believed they had chosen survival, that mercy had prevailed, that the stories which haunted them were exaggerations crafted by the traumatized. But the moment they were escorted beyond the city walls, they saw the earth carved open in monstrous trenches, wide enough to swallow entire battalions. Confusion tightened into dread because the men digging those pits were not building fortifications. They were preparing graves on a scale the human mind was never meant to comprehend. There was no battlefield, no executioner, no sword raised in cruelty or anger, only the silent hunger of the ground itself waiting to consume the living. Tamerlane stood by as the surrendered soldiers were pushed toward the edges of the pits, and it was then, in that grotesque unveiling, that the truth settled in their bones. He had kept his oath perfectly. He had vowed that not a drop of their blood would be shed, and indeed none would be spilled, not by blades, not by arrows, not by any weapon forged by human hands. Instead, they were cast into the trenches alive, packed tightly as their screams tangled in the air, their bodies colliding in desperate attempts to break free from the nightmare unfolding around them. The first loads of earth fell lightly, almost benignly, like a cruel joke. Then came more, shovelful after shovelful. Then entire carts of soil heaved into the pit with ruthless efficiency, each wave burying limbs, torsos, and faces until only muffled cries seeped through the rising layers of dirt. The weight became unbearable. The men at the bottom were crushed beneath the collapsing mass of bodies. Those trapped in the middle clawed at anything they could reach, arms, hair, clothing driven not by hatred, but by the primal instinct to survive just one more breath. And those at the top met their ends slowly, watching daylight disappear grain by grain until darkness swallowed them completely. Suffocation replaced bleeding, silence replaced chaos. It was death engineered with such precision that even the most brutal warriors of the age struggled to describe it without their hands shaking. In that moment, Tamerlane demonstrated something far more frightening than simple violence. He showed that promises could be weapons, that mercy could be reshaped into a trap, and that the human mind could be broken not by overwhelming force, but by meticulously crafted terror. The burial at Sivas was not only an atrocity, it was a message broadcast across continents. It taught every city that surrender did not guarantee safety, that an oath could be twisted until it strangled those who trusted it, and that this conqueror played by rules no one else understood. And as news of this horror raced across kingdoms and empires, entire populations realized they were no longer deciding between fighting or yielding. They were deciding how they preferred to die. If the burial at Sivas demonstrated Tamerlane's ability to weaponize promises, then the annihilation of Urgench revealed the terrifying extent to which he could erase not just lives, but entire civilizations when provoked. Urgench was not an ordinary city. It was one of the great jewels of Central Asia, a thriving hub of culture, commerce, scholarship, and architectural brilliance. Its markets shimmered with goods from Persia, China, and India. Its libraries housed manuscripts copied by generations of scholars. Its mosques soared with artistry that reflected centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. Any rational conqueror would have wanted to rule such a city intact, to absorb its wealth and harness its influence. But Tamerlane did not view rebellion as a political inconvenience that could be fixed with executions and new governors. He saw it as a personal violation, an affront to his authority so deep that it demanded not punishment but obliteration. When Urgench dared to defy him, it unknowingly signed its own death certificate. Tamerlane arrived not as a ruler reclaiming territory, but as a force of nature bent on unmaking what existed. The siege itself was brutal but swift, for his forces were seasoned veterans of relentless warfare, men who understood exactly what their master expected from them. When the walls finally fell, the storm that poured into Urgench was not a disciplined army maintaining order. It was a tidal wave of destruction. Tamerlane's orders were chillingly simple: eliminate every living soul and dismantle everything that gave the city identity, function, or future. His soldiers surged through the streets with terrifying coordination, entering homes, mosques, workshops, and marketplaces, extinguishing lives without hesitation. The rich, the poor, the elderly, the children, none were spared, because Tamerlane was not trying to conquer Urgench, he was trying to erase it from the map of the world. The massacre was only the first stage. Once the population had been wiped out, Tamerlane turned his attention to the city itself. He understood the psychology of empire better than anyone of his era. Cities could recover from tragedy. Survivors could rebuild. Time could heal wounds. But if the very bones of a city, the buildings, the monuments, the infrastructure, were destroyed completely, then there would be nothing left to repair. His soldiers tore down structures stone by stone, reducing towering walls and centuries-old buildings to indistinguishable rubble. Libraries that once held the accumulated wisdom of generations were burned to ash. Markets that had bustled with life were flattened without a trace. Mosques, places of worship for the same faith Tamerlane claimed, were demolished with deliberate indifference, because even religion was insignificant compared to the message he intended to send. And then came the final act, the one that transformed Urgench's destruction into something almost ritualistic. Tamerlane ordered his men to plow the ruined landscape as if it were farmland, carving deep furrows where streets and foundations once stood. After that, the command was given to scatter barley seeds across the devastated terrain. Whether the barley sowing happened precisely as chroniclers describe, or whether it became a symbolic embellishment added by horrified witnesses, the meaning was unmistakable. Tamerlane was declaring to the world that Urgench was no longer a city, no longer a collection of memories, triumphs, and stories passed down through generations. It was now nothing more than a field, a blank piece of earth where civilization had once flourished. It was an uncreation, a deliberate undoing of everything human hands had built. The destruction was so complete that Urgench did not recover. Not in the following years, not even in the generation that followed. Eventually, a new settlement with the same name emerged miles away, but it shared no continuity with the original. The ancient city that had once dazzled travelers and scholars simply disappeared, swallowed by the will of a conqueror who believed that fear was more powerful than armies. For those who heard the tale of Urgenk, there was no confusion about Tamerlane's message. Rebellion did not lead to defeat, rebellion led to erasure. And as the story spread across continents, city after city realized that defying him was not an act of bravery. It was an invitation to cease existing. If Urgench showed how Tamerlane responded to rebellion, then the fate of Isfahan revealed something even more disturbing: the catastrophic consequences of misjudging his mercy. Isfahan was one of Persia's greatest cultural centers, a city renowned for its artistry, scholarship, architecture, and thriving commerce. When Tamerlane's army appeared at its gates in 1387, the leaders of the city understood the scale of the threat approaching them. They had heard of Sivas and the thousands buried alive. They had heard of Urgench and the city turned to farmland, and unlike others who clung to pride or desperation, the rulers of Isfahan decided that survival required humility. They surrendered immediately, opened their gates, and placed themselves under Tamerlane's authority before a single siege engine was dragged into place. It should have been the correct decision, and for a brief moment it seemed like it was. Tamerlane accepted their submission without bloodshed. He did not order a massacre. He did not raze their buildings. He did not burn their markets or tear down their mosques. Instead, he stationed a garrison in the city, appointed administrators, and imposed a tax to support his ongoing campaigns. Life in Isfahan changed, but it did not collapse. Families still gathered in courtyards at night, merchants still opened their shops, children still played in alleyways, and the people of the city exhaled in relief, believing they had escaped the fate of others who had suffered under Tamerlane's wrath. But beneath that fragile peace simmered frustration, resentment, and a deep anger over the burden of taxation imposed by foreign conquerors. What began as hushed complaints in markets gradually evolved into simmering unrest, until that frustration finally ignited into a coordinated uprising that targeted Tamerlane's tax collectors and then escalated into violence against the entire occupying garrison. When news of the rebellion reached Tamerlane, those who knew him understood immediately that the city had crossed an unforgivable boundary. He could tolerate a city that fought openly from the start because defiance in battle was part of the accepted language of war. What he could not accept, what he viewed as a personal and moral betrayal, was for a city to surrender, receive mercy, enjoy the benefits of survival, and then spit in the face of that mercy by killing his soldiers. Such a betrayal demanded not a correction, but a demonstration, one powerful enough to echo across continents and permanently reshape how cities calculated their choices. So Tamerlane returned to Isfahan, not with diplomacy or negotiations, but with an order that transformed the city into a theater of terror. He commanded a general massacre, but it was not the type of indiscriminate violence that erupted as a momentary frenzy. It was a calculated, structured, almost administrative form of slaughter. Every military unit in his army was assigned a specific quota of severed heads that they were required to produce, a number that had to be fulfilled regardless of age, gender, or status. What followed was a torment so vast that the human mind struggles to grasp it. Tamerlane's soldiers fanned through Isfahan with chilling efficiency, breaking into homes, dragging families into the streets, and executing them to meet their quotas. The killing went on for days, transforming neighborhoods into rivers of blood and filling the air with a stench so overwhelming that chroniclers described it as suffocating even from a distance. Some attempt to estimate the death toll placed it at 200,000, though modern historians consider 70,000 a more realistic figure. But the distinction becomes meaningless when you imagine thousands upon thousands of bodies strewn through the city, each representing a life extinguished in a single catastrophic episode of violence. And then came the part that seared itself into the memory of every traveler who passed through the region. Tamerlane ordered his soldiers to gather the severed heads and use them to build towers, monuments constructed not from brick or stone, but from human skulls. These macabre structures were erected in public spaces, at city gates, and along major roads, each one a silent proclamation of what awaited those who mistook Tamerlane's brief mercy for weakness. Chroniclers attempted to count the towers, claiming to have documented many before they physically could not continue, overwhelmed by the horror before them. These towers became symbols known across the world, lasting for years as a reminder that Isfahan's fatal mistake was not rebellion alone. It was trusting a mercy they did not fully understand. And through this terrifying spectacle, Tamerlane taught the world that the cost of betrayal was a legacy written in bone. By the time Tamerlane turned his attention toward India, he had already carved a path of devastation across Central Asia and Persia, leaving behind ruined cities, shattered dynasties, and entire regions that spoke his name with dread. Yet none of those earlier horrors prepared the world for what he unleashed upon Delhi in 1398. Delhi was not merely another city to conquer. It was a legendary capital, a center of immense wealth, culture, architecture, and military strength. The Delhi Sultanate commanded vast resources and was regarded as one of the most formidable powers of its era. But Tamerlane was not intimidated by fortresses or armies, because he believed that clever minds and cold ambitions could overcome forces that outnumbered or outmatched him. He justified his invasion by claiming that the rulers of Delhi were too lenient toward their Hindu subjects, a claim wrapped in religious rhetoric but thinly masking his real intentions. Wealth, prestige, and the desire to dominate yet another empire drove him forward, and with a massive army of hardened warriors behind him, he marched south toward one of the richest cities of the medieval world. As he advanced through northern India, the countryside experienced a nightmare that defied comprehension. Villages were plundered methodically, crops burned without hesitation, and residents either massacred or taken captive by the tens of thousands. It became increasingly difficult for Tamerlane's army to move simply because it had acquired too many prisoners. Men, women, and children seized from every settlement, unfortunate enough to lie along the path of conquest. The chronicles describe these captives numbering around 100,000 by the time Tamerlane approached Delhi. He realized that if battle erupted, these masses of prisoners could revolt from behind, creating chaos and endangering his forces. In the cold calculus that governed his decisions, these captives were a liability, not a resource. And so, before the decisive battle with the Sultan's forces even began, Tamerlane ordered a chilling solution: the mass execution of every single prisoner under his army's control. A single day was consumed by this unimaginable atrocity. Soldiers walked through the sprawling encampments, slaughtering the unarmed captives with a level of systematic precision that turned the landscape into a grotesque tableau of bodies and blood. Chroniclers described the ground becoming so saturated with human remains that the soil itself seemed to change color and texture, as if the earth was rejecting what had been forced upon it. When the final cries faded and the massacre ended, Tamerlane had eliminated 100,000 prisoners, not through rage or impulse, but through a decision made with cold, strategic clarity. And with that burden removed, he advanced toward Delhi, fully prepared for the battle that awaited him. The Sultan's forces were formidable, bolstered by elite soldiers and a terrifying secret weapon, over 100 heavily armored war elephants outfitted with poisoned blades attached to their tusks. These beasts were meant to be the decisive element on the battlefield, creatures whose mere presence could break enemy lines. But Tamerlane, ever the master of studying opponents, devised a strategy so shocking that it transformed the battlefield into a spectacle of chaos. He ordered his men to load his baggage camels with dry grass and hay, set them ablaze, and drive the flaming animals toward the charging elephants. The elephants, overwhelmed by the horror of living torches rushing toward them, turned in panic and trampled their own army, plunging the Sultan's forces into catastrophic disorder. Seizing the moment, Tamerlane's troops surged forward, overwhelmed the disoriented defenders, and claimed a decisive victory. With the battlefield conquered, the city of Delhi lay helpless before him, and what followed were 5 days of devastation so intense that they seemed almost apocalyptic. Tamerlane's soldiers entered the city not as victors seeking plunder, but as executioners carrying out a meticulously organized purge. Neighborhoods were overrun, homes breached, and helpless civilians dragged into the streets as soldiers satisfied their hunger for loot, for dominance, and for fulfilling their leaders' unspoken expectation that Delhi should not simply fall, it should collapse. The city's wealth was stripped, its cultural treasures shattered, its population massacred by the tens of thousands. Fires raged uncontrollably, consuming buildings and filling the air with smoke so dense that some chroniclers claimed the sun vanished behind a black veil. The stench of corpses became so overwhelming that surviving citizens eventually fled, leaving behind a once magnificent city transformed into a haunted ruin. When Tamerlane finally departed Delhi, he did so not with remorse or apology, but with captured war elephants dragging massive stones to be used in constructing monuments in Samarkand. The very animals that symbolized Delhi's strength were reduced to beasts of burden serving his glory. The wounds inflicted on the city were so deep that Delhi required more than a century to recover its former vitality. In its suffering, Tamerlane delivered yet another message to the world. Wealth, power, and prestige meant nothing when standing before a conqueror who believed destruction itself was a form of art. If Delhi revealed Tamerlane's appetite for destruction, then Baghdad exposed the final, perfected form of his cruelty, a blend of punishment, hatred, calculation, and psychological warfare so immense that even hardened chroniclers struggled to capture it on parchment without their hands trembling. Baghdad was not merely another target of conquest. It was a city whose very name carried centuries of glory. For 500 years, it had been one of the greatest centers of scholarship, science, literature, trade, and culture in the Islamic world, a city whose golden age had illuminated the entire Middle East. Even though it had declined from its former brilliance by the time Tamerlane approached in 1401, Baghdad remained one of history's most storied capitals. Tamerlane had conquered it once before, and the city had accepted his rule. But while he was campaigning elsewhere, Baghdad's former ruler recaptured it, defying him openly and boldly, as if the memory of his other massacres had not carved deep warnings into the world. For Tamerlane, this was not a minor revolt. It was a betrayal layered over humiliation, the kind of insult that demanded not justice but annihilation. Once the siege began, everyone inside the city understood that their fate hung by the thinnest thread. The defenders fought desperately for more than 40 days, but they were facing an army whose resolve had been forged through countless battles and whose leader believed that mercy was a privilege earned only by obedience. When the walls finally fell and Tamerlane's forces surged into Baghdad like a tidal wave of steel and fury, there was no confusion about what would come next. But even then, the people of Baghdad could not anticipate the exact shape of the horror he had prepared for them, because Tamerlane did not merely want to punish the city. He wanted to turn it into a monument of suffering so unforgettable that it would echo across generations. His order was simple, brutal, and devastating in its efficiency. Every soldier in his army was to return with at least 2 severed heads. This quota did not distinguish between young or old, wealthy or poor, combatant or non-combatant. It transformed the massacre into a twisted competition in which soldiers, terrified of failing their commander, raced to drag every living person from their homes. Families were slaughtered together. Entire neighborhoods emptied in hours. And in many cases the panic became so overwhelming that people took shelter in wells, in basements, in hidden rooms and crypts, only to be dragged out when soldiers smashed through walls or tore apart wooden floors in their search for victims. The quotas turned murder into a mechanical process that allowed no hesitation or mercy. Some chroniclers recorded that soldiers who could not find enough victims resorted to killing their own slaves, and others described a frenzy so intense that even valuable captives who could have been ransomed were executed simply to meet the required number. But the full horror of the event came not from the killing itself, but from what followed. Tamerlane, consistent in his macabre symbolism, ordered the collected heads to be used as construction material for massive towers, structures built entirely from the skulls of Baghdad's dead. The accounts vary widely. Some claim there were 90 towers, others say 100, and a few assert that there were 120, each one rising like a grotesque monument to cruelty. Each tower represented thousands of people who had been alive only days before, and these structures were placed in highly visible areas, near city gates, major intersections, and along important roads, ensuring that every survivor and every traveler would confront the full magnitude of Tamerlane's wrath. Chroniclers who saw them described suffering physical illness at the sight, overwhelmed by the combination of horror, stench, and the unimaginable scale of death these towers represented. And yet even this was not enough for Tamerlane. He ordered the destruction of many of Baghdad's most significant public buildings. Libraries that held centuries of knowledge were burned, palaces were deliberately torn down, markets were looted and destroyed. Entire districts that had once thrived were reduced to ruins. Curiously, he spared most religious sites, but this was not an act of piety, it was calculated symbolism. Tamerlane wanted the world to believe that he was not attacking faith but punishing defiance, and by leaving the mosques standing amidst oceans of devastation, he crafted a message that rebellion, not religion, had brought this catastrophe upon the city. When Tamerlane finally left Baghdad, the city stood hollowed out, its people traumatized or dead, its buildings collapsed, and its legacy wounded so deeply that centuries would pass before it could reclaim even a fraction of its former greatness. With Baghdad, Tamerlane completed his repertoire of terror, proving that he did not merely defeat cities, he transformed them into warnings. The 5 acts that carved his name into history were not random explosions of violence, but deliberate performances of fear, each one designed to echo far beyond its moment, ensuring that his shadow stretched across continents long after his empire crumbled.